Representative, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Johns Creek City Council, then the State House. Now you're running for Secretary of State in this runoff. Why Secretary of State?
Well, it touches so many areas. I'm a licensed engineer and a business owner, first off. So if you look at the Secretary of State's office, I know everyone's been talking about elections, but the Secretary of State's office is in charge of occupational professional licensing. There's over 130 different licenses and 40 different boards. I'm a licensed structural engineer. I understand the critical importance of licensing. And then it touches corporation as a business owner. It's very important that you have a very responsive corporations division, and anything I can do to facilitate, business generation, entrepreneurial formation, that's something that I'm going to support, obviously. And then it touches elections, and I've said since day one, I want to make sure that only American citizens are voting in our elections. I think election integrity is very important.
Do you see any evidence that people who are not American citizens are voting illegally in Georgia?
Yeah, there's actually, I don't know about in Georgia, and we've done a great job in Georgia. We need to make sure that we remain vigilant in that area. But there have been people that have been prosecuted. One lady in Texas, she assumed her sister's identity, and she was convicted and got 10 years. And then recently, 19 people in North Carolina were non-citizens, and they've been indicted and charged with voting in the 2016 election. So it's something that we always need to make sure that we're making sure we have procedures in place to make sure that we have our guardrails and the process in place that only Americans vote, that we have lawful voters that are voting, and that we want to make sure that we encourage everyone to vote. I think the last election, I know that it got a lot of people concerned, but it was actually a great thing. We had great turnout, and that's a good thing, that people were energized, and they were energized on both sides, and they got out and voted, and that's good. We want people to vote.
Okay. If you had to give this past election a grade, what would the grade be?
Oh, that's an interesting, I'm not a school teacher, so I don't know what I would do. What I would say is I know there's been some frustration on some people. Some things have been just blown out of proportion with a lot of hyperbole. And so really, if I win this election as your state election officer, I really want to stand back a little bit and really survey the landscape and really look at what are best practices. What do we need to work on? What do we need to improve? But I do know this, is I don't think we were prepared for the number of people that did show up. Because if you look at the historical numbers of what people show up, the percentages that show up for a midterm election, we swamped that boat. And it's, unfortunately, in a wedding, you send out your invitations, you invite 100 people, you get RSVPs, and you sort of know who's going to show up that day. But on elections, you don't know who's really going to show up. And I think we weren't prepared for those big numbers we have. So I think we now need to go back, and I think we need to do some better research, better preparation, so we're prepared for those numbers, because that may be something we will see in the 2020 election, 2022 going forward. And that's a good thing.
Well, Stacey Abrams is filing a federal lawsuit claiming not mismanagement, that some of what she says was intentional with regard to voters being purged from the rolls, also having to stand in inordinately long lines, machines not working. I mean, I get what you say about a big turnout, but we knew going in this was going to be a close race, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. It seems as though the ball was dropped in a lot of different places.
Well, the counties have the responsibility of making sure they have the polling places at the right locations and the right number of machines. And sometimes they did not meet that standard that we would expect. I went in and I voted early, and it took me about 10 to 15 minutes. But we still had lines, but they moved through very rapidly. Other places, there were long lines. So I think we need to make sure that we have enough voting machines, when we come into the next election. But that goes to the voting machines themselves. Those voting machines, we need new voting machines. Right. The ones we have right now are 16 years old, and we need to upgrade to the latest technology that's cyber secure and make sure that we have a verifiable paper ballot trail.
Now, how much would that cost, and is the money there to do what you think needs to be done?
Well, right now there's no money to do anything, because that's going to have to come from the General Assembly. They're going to have to really authorize and allocate the funding for that. And I believe that's something that they're going to be looking at this upcoming session. There's the Safe Commission that's done its work, and done a portion of its work. They need to finish up that and offer some recommendations. But the General Assembly is going to have to make that hard, difficult choice of, what are the funds, what are we going to allocate, and then probably set some guardrails on the type of machines that they find acceptable. Because right now in America, there's actually 7 different types of voting machines, voting systems that are used. So go from hand-marked paper ballots to systems that we have right here in Georgia. There's still 4 states that use systems with DREs, that's electronic machines we have, without a paper trail. Then there's other folks that are using DREs with paper trails. And there's a host of different other systems.
What do you think we ought to do? What kind of machine do you think Georgia needs?
I prefer a system that has a mechanically marked ballot and then with an optical scanner. I'm not a real fan of the hand-marked paper ballot that they used in Florida. Some people say, well, they had old scanners. Well, that may be true. But also, what we want to make sure is that when the ballot leaves your hand, it can never be changed. And one thing about a hand-marked paper ballot, if it ever was done with pencil, you know that that can be changed. Whereas if it's electronically marked, it cannot be changed once it leaves your hand. Once it leaves your hand and it goes into the scanner and it's counted, then it needs to be secured in that box. So if we have to do a recount, that we can then actually have something to open up and do the recount with.
Okay. John Barrow has said that people have a right not to vote, that it's not fair to throw somebody off the voter roll simply because they haven't shown up for a couple of elections because they're not jazzed by whoever happens to be on the ballot at that time. Why do you disagree with that?
Well, I agree with him that we all have the right not to vote. It's I want you to vote, but and you're a really nice guy, but I'm not going to drive over to your house, pick you up to make you vote. That's your right as a free American citizen.
But the point is, if you haven't voted for 10 years, why should you have to jump through another hoop if you're still living in the same place?
Because what happens is 10 to 15% of all Georgians are moving every year. And someone's not really bringing that to your attention. So in 4 years, with 10 to 15% of people moving every year, just imagine if you don't update your rolls, how inaccurate, how dirty they would be. And John Barrow says he'll never take anyone off the voter rolls. What you could end up with is a list that's not clean. And when a list hangs out there and it doesn't have people that actually still live in those homes, you could end up with voter fraud because it's just a recipe. People know. When people go to the voter vault, they can see who's voting and who's not voting. And people that are up to mischief. And there are people that actually would do something like that. We look for who hasn't voted because it just sat there for 10, 12 years. And that's the whole purpose. And that's why last year the Supreme Court upheld the standard that Ohio uses. And that's the same standard that Georgia uses.
Right. Do you think that the Democratic criticism that Republicans are doing this, at least with the intent of discouraging minority vote, does that hold any weight at all? Is that part of the Republican calculation? Not
with me. I want to make sure that everyone votes. I really don't care what their demographic background is. I don't care really what their party affiliation is. I will be the Secretary of State for the entire state of Georgia, no matter where you live, no matter what party you're from, and no matter what your background is, and no matter what your economic well-being is. That is my responsibility, is to get the job done right, to make sure we have clean, fair, and accurate elections. And that's what I'm going to fight for.
Okay. Now, as you know, obviously, these elections are primarily managed on the county level. All 159 counties run their own. So how much control do you have over the smooth running of an election if you're elected Secretary of State?
I think that there's a really great place that someone like myself can bring to bear. As opposed to me being top down and really demanding and pushing people, first of all, I don't know if that's really the constitutional authority that the Secretary of State has, but also I don't think it's really productive. I'd rather come alongside these counties and say, where do you need help? Also, we take a look and we look at what's happened. We do it just like we would in business. We're going to go back and do a 360. What went well? Where did we have some weak spots? And which counties were those weak spots there? And then sitting down with the county election boards, the county commissioners, and say, here's where we saw some problems. Here's where we'd like to come along, and we'd like to help you in your efforts. I really want to be their partner. I don't want to be their boss. It's not my role to be their boss, but also when I come along as their partner, I think I'm going to get buy-in. I'm going to work with people, and I think that's really important. And they probably do need help in many areas. Some of these counties have less than 10,000 people. They just don't have the resources that we will have down at the state capitol. And so wherever I can do to make sure that we have clean, fair, and accurate elections, I'm going to be working towards that because it's very important.
Okay. Let me ask you about a couple of the ads that have come out recently. One from the Democrats renewing the charge that you had $130,000 in tax liens. You've already answered the question and said you don't owe those, right. But here's that ad as we get to the last 10 days of the election. What's your response to the ad?
Well, it's a dishonest ad. Someone made that charge, 6 months ago, and we gave all the information to another reporting agency, and they looked at it and they said, you're right, there's nothing here. Any open liens that we did have, I said I'd be happy to take a look at them. There's a few that were less than $5,000, and we went ahead and cleared that up. I have a business right now that does over $30 million a year. I work in over 30 different states. And I said if there's anything that we overlooked, I would take a look at it. But I don't know Mississippi anything. I don't know anyone anything. In fact, last year I actually paid more taxes than I was supposed to, and I applied it for my 2018. So you can say right now the government actually owes me money, but I do not owe taxes to anyone. So what he's doing is just more of what he always does. He's a lifelong career politician. He'll say anything to get elected, and then when he gets caught on his bad votes, like he's actually the guy that voted against the Federal Election Integrity Act of 2006. And now he realizes that was a bad vote because he was voting in his heart, and that's what he voted for. And he didn't believe in photo ID. And that was the cornerstone of that bill. And then in 2011, him and 196 other Democrats, they sent out an email to every state secretary of state. They sent a letter to them and said that they opposed identification requirements. Well, photo ID is an identification requirement. And if you oppose that, then what do you really stand for? But now he's saying that he doesn't, he's disavowing those statements, or he's saying, well, you don't have it right. The first bill did this, the second bill did that. No, the facts are the facts.
Okay.
And he's not being truthful.
Let me ask you about the ad that says that if he is made Secretary of State, that there will be, let me make sure I get this right, there will be more illegal voting than ever. What's the basis for that charge?
If you don't clean up your voter rolls, then you're opening the recipe for voter fraud. In fact, if you read, there's some great literature out there. Number one is a book by John Fund called, Stealing Elections, The Threat to American Democracy. And it goes through all the hijinks that we've had over 100 years. And guess what? Republicans did it, Democrats did it. And it's bad to say that the Republican Party would ever do that, but some of this stuff happened long ago, and some of it's happened in the recent past.
But if we have photo ID in Georgia, how is someone who's in the country illegally or who's not registered to vote going to get away with that?
You have to make sure that when people show up, that people actually demand their ID for one thing. So that's one thing, and we actually have an updated voter roll. You also then, if the voter roll is not updated, you could vote through other means such as the absentee ballot process. And in John Fund's book, he says that's actually the greatest threat to lack of integrity in the voting process. And the 2005 Nonpartisan Presidential Commission that was chaired by President Jimmy Carter and Secretary of State Baker made that exact same point.
Okay. Let me circle back to one question that I'd just really like to get a precise answer for you, if you have one. How much do you think it would cost to create the kind of system that you think Georgia ought to have? And how do you get the legislature to pony up?
In the range, I think for updated voting machines, we're probably looking in the range of about $50 million, give or take. But we haven't put that out to bids yet. We don't know what that's going to cost. But it's also a 1-2 effort. While we're updating the voting machines, and that's a very important part, we also want to update really the scanning process. And it would be the scanners, particularly for the absentee ballot system. With the updated scanner systems that are out there, we should be able to do the early voting for Fulton County, as I've been told, by 10 o'clock at night. Now, if I
like
can
the rest of the country.
Right, the rest of the country, exactly.
Right.
And to me, that almost needs to be, it's not job one, but it's up in the top 10. Because the rest of the state is really tired of waiting for Fulton and DeKalb County, waiting till 1 or 2 o'clock. And so we can get those results done soon. That's really good. And as an engineer, I'm going to be looking at that from the standpoint of process flow. Are there two systems? They're both good systems, both the same price, but we get 20% more output with this system. I'm going to really lean towards that one because that's more efficient, and I will be looking at that.
Okay. This is not your first runoff. Had that one in Johns Creek and one for the State House. I wonder what you think about these runoffs as a democratic exercise, in the sense that whoever decides who's going to be the next Secretary of State, however many, it's going to be far fewer than the vote on November 8th. Is there anything undemocratic about that in your mind?
Well, if we wouldn't have had a runoff, then I'd now be your Secretary of State.
Right, 16,000 votes, right?
But I think that it's much better when we actually do have a runoff, because at the end of the day, it's really like we're winnowing it down, and the person that will be your Secretary of State will have 50 plus 1. Every Georgian has the opportunity to come out and vote, and I hope they do. But we do know in runoffs, typically, it's tough to get people back out to the polls. But at the end of the day, the person that does win this race will have over 50% of the vote. And I think that's a good thing. That's what they do, obviously, in France for their presidential runs. That's what they do in Brazil. And with our type of system, it really makes a lot of sense. I know it does cost more, but I think people then can say at least that over 50% of the voters did vote for that person, whoever that is. And I think that's something that I support.
The Libertarian in this race endorsed John Barrow after having finished with 2% of the votes. What do you say to the Libertarians who voted for him?
Well, what I'd say to all Libertarians, if you really go back in history to 1980 and Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan had a huge contingent of part of his coalition that he built was Libertarians. You look at Senator Alan Simpson, he was a Republican, they say, but he's really a Libertarian. Because Libertarians, they believe in limited government, smaller government. They want to see that licensing wherever you don't need it, as it relates to the Secretary of State's office. Can we deregulate? Can we streamline those licenses? Can we lower the fees? Can we actually increase competition, not stifle competition? Those are all Republican principles. And so Libertarians, if they're looking for someone that's independent-minded like they are, I'm their person. If they're looking for the individual, I'm that person. And if they're looking for group identity, then they're going to be looking for someone else.
Okay, last question. If you decide in the next 3 years to run for governor of Georgia, as the previous Secretary of State did, would you think it would be fair for you to oversee your own election?
Well, I haven't really ever thought about that because I have no intention of running for any other office. If you look at my runway, I'm 63 years old. And I think if I do a great job at Secretary of State, I think that'll be enough to say grace over.
Okay. Do you think Brian Kemp should have resigned before he did?
That was Brian Kemp's decision, and I had no problem with it because I think at the end of the day, he was not counting the votes. It was done at the county level. I also know Brian Kemp. I've worked with him on bills in the State House. He's a man of high integrity. And so I think those charges were unfounded and unfair.
Brad Raffensperger, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Russ.
Appreciate you coming in.